Warning. The following episode contains graphic depictions, discussions of death and mutilation, discussions of violence, and presentations of otherworldly horror. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to the Foundation, new recruit. I don't have too much to say today, but following last week's adventures with Max Lombardi, this week I want to take some time to discuss some SCPs that you're already familiar with. The first of these will be SCP-106, the Old Man, which you might recall from a tale that we discussed a few weeks ago, or from what might have been the very first lesson that we covered, when I covered his primary file in the logs. The second of these will be SCP-682, colloquially known as the hard-to-destroy Reptile. It is my hope that, by listening to these tales, that you will gain a deeper and more whole understanding of some of the SCPs that we've been working on in these lessons, and for you to know just how much history and horror exists behind these SCPs that you don't necessarily get from the main files. Following this, I'll take some time to teach you about the on-site nuclear warheads that exist in every Foundation site. As you may expect, I will do this using a hypothetical tale of one Foundation researcher in Pennsylvania. Then, because this is quite intense of a topic set, I will conclude with something a bit more light-hearted to calm the atmosphere. I'll tell you about some of our anomalous items that aren't significant enough to be their own SCPs and to have their own files and research teams, but are still interesting nonetheless. I will approach this in the same way that I approached the logs from the Reluctant Dimension Hopper, otherwise known as SCP-507. And without any further ado, let us begin. Our first story of today is The Young Man, presented to us by Dr. Gears. Nobody could like Corporal Lawrence. That's not to say that nobody tried or that he was somehow unfriendly, merely that he was one of those few that seemed to be wired differently. However, in the trenches of World War I, normalcy was, at best, a relative term, and one that had minimal relation of life, such as it was. Lawrence fought, listened to orders, and didn't disrupt the other soldiers, and that was all that was required. So what if people felt increasingly uncomfortable around him? In a place where the flesh rotting off your bones while you were still alive was the baseline of concern, a little personality conflict ranked several levels below a paper cut. Lawrence, for his part, dealt with it like he always had. That is to say, remained totally unaware of the avoidance. The same way a man blind from birth cannot mourn the memory of color, Corporal Lawrence couldn't bemoan a lack of company. He was quiet, as he had nobody to talk to, and still, as he had nothing to do for long stretches of time. The enemy trench, less than a mile away, had gone silent for several days, letting boredom and nervousness sink in even more than normal, coupled with the unease that seemed to radiate off Lawrence like heat waves. The worst part is that there was no distinct reason to dislike the corporal. He was a plain man, average height, average build, bland of voice and action. Nobody could recall him raising his voice in joy or anger. He did have the occasional odd mannerisms, however. He tended to stare a beat or two longer than was acceptable at people. He rarely slept as well, and bunkmates said he would mumble in his sleep almost constantly. The content of those nocturnal rumblings, when they could be understood, were often odd and potentially unsettling. One private moved to another barracks when he heard the name of his daughter pass Corporal Lawrence's lips, following a bubbling, muffled giggle. It was strongly theorized that he was sent over the trench by his commanders more out of a desire to have him away than for his minimal combat skill. He and 14 of his fellows were sent across the nightmarishly scarred waste of no man's land between the trenches to reconnoiter the enemy trench and secure it if possible. Many seemed to hope that Lawrence would have the opportunity to prove his devotion to his country by making the ultimate sacrifice for it. It was while he was gone, the 3-day gap as men held their breath, waiting for a surprise volley of shells, that someone started asking questions. Whereas before, it was almost taboo to speak of Corporal Lawrence, since the departure of both him and his aura, rumors seemed to descend with the passion of the denied. Nobody remembered him ever talking of home. No sweet-smelling letters came, no soggy, dirt-streaked letters left. He mentioned his dreams often, and griped sometimes with the men over missed foods or pleasures, but never with any real passion. Questions started to float among even the higher levels of command. Nobody was able to actually find his station orders. He'd come in with a squad of reinforcements transferred from France, but there was no paperwork. The rest of the reinforcement squad had never seen the man before he'd been lumped in with them the night before the trip, along with the snips and scraps of other squads decimated by the Germans. Whispers filtered among the grunts of the corporal being a curse. Nearly every man who shared a bunkhouse with him had gotten trench foot, and the rooms he haunted always seemed to smell more musty and sickly sweet, even for the trench. The men sent over the no man's land with Corporal Lawrence heard and cared for none of this. Just another man among many, all with death certificates awaiting a stamp that could fall at any moment. They moved fast and low, from crater to crater, slipping over slick mud and barbed wire, the only thing that seemed to grow in that blasted waste. Charging the last spurt and into the trench, they were greeted not with the harsh bark of German orders and rifles, but a dense, close silence. Preparing for ambush, the men started to filter out into the tunnels and halls of the trench. The men, already nervous, were not calmed by their investigation. The trenches stank of mold, sweat, and a thin undertaste of rotten fruit. A vile, cloying slime seemed to have pooled in every divot and crack, sticky as glue and itchy on the flesh. In a world where rats and insects would try to snatch food from your mouth even as you ate, they saw nothing alive, not so much as a fly. An armory lay in chaos, munitions spilled on the ground, rifles tossed like pickup sticks, a mess hall that had been reduced to ruins, the tables and chairs piled up in the center of the room, all charred and twisted, and the rations seemingly stamped into the dirt by many feet. And still, nothing, alive or dead, was found by the increasingly anxious soldiers. Private Dixon found the first body, and managed to cry out before vomiting. They knew it had been a man only because nothing else of that size could have been there. It lay on the floor of the barracks, the entire floor. The flesh of it had been smeared somehow, spread like butter over the rough dirt floor. Bones, already looking pitted and rotten, stuck out at random angles, like dead trees in a still swamp. The skull rested on one of the highest bunks, facing the doorway, 10 gleaming white fingertip bones crammed into the eye sockets. As one man went to examine it, he found the back of the skull had been crushed open, the rotting, sagging sponge of a tongue stuffed into the otherwise dry cavity. More remains were found, each seemingly more unsettling and strange than the last. A ring of hands in a sandbagged watchpost, 10 of them, fingers interlaced like a basket and wrists ragged and broken. 2 men in a tunnel, skin leathery and thin as mummies, eye sockets staring and empty, mouths locked impossibly wide, their clothes mere rags under an oily black scum. The latrines sent even the hardiest back, gagging and shivering, overflowing with excrement and offal, goblets of meat bobbed and oozed in the foul sludge. The whole surface dotted with what looked like thousands of clean, slick eyeballs, nerves, tendons, all fanning out like goldfish tails. Corporal Lawrence was the first to find the hole. The other men loudly debating the better part of valor and the rapid withdrawal from the nightmare trench. It was small, in a section of fresh digging, the start of a new arm of trenches projecting closer to the enemy lines. No more than 4 or 5 feet across, it seemed to be the accidental uncovering of a natural chamber, the empty blackness of it defying investigation. Private Dixon, recovered and blessedly numb from his previous ordeals, saw the corporal prod the edge with his boot, then crouched to peer in. then suddenly slide in head first before the private could so much as utter a shout or question. The private was a good soldier and rushed to the perceived distress of his fellow. When questioned later, he could provide little illumination as to what happened over the next 2 minutes as Corporal Lawrence spent them in the hole. He could see nothing, the light of a torch seemingly gobbled up a few feet into that dense blackness. There were sounds, the rustle of movement over loose stone or rubble, an odd liquid shifting, a dry rustle that made him think of the insect husk he used to collect in the summer. As he shouted for aid, there was a sudden upwelling of a repulsive stench, like a reptile house gone sour and old, and his fellow soldiers found him retching helplessly beside the hole when they came around the turn. It was as they rushed to Private Dixon's aid that the hand emerged from the hole. They stopped and raised rifles as one body, roaring for the owner of that pale, trembling hand to identify himself. As they watched, another hand joined the first, followed by the pale, shivering head of Corporal Lawrence. He was streaked and smeared with a tarry black ooze, hacking and coughing thinly as he hauled his body up beside that of the grasping private. As they moved to help the man, the corporal vomited up a heavy stream of the same repulsive slime that coated his body in smears and globs, his curled, shuddering body voiding more of it into his shattered, fouled pants. They were hesitant to touch him, finally doing so after the seemingly endless river of grime stopped pouring from him. He was insensible, eyes rolling and wide, body as limp as a boned fish. The men quit the trench with all speed. Half dragging the corporal, they ran with no thought to cover or death, only escape. They crossed in record time, falling into their home trench like so much cordwood, gasping and shivering. One man known to have bludgeoned a German to death with a brick curled on the floor in a sobbing heap. The commanders moved quickly, isolating the men and trying to calm the most lucid for a report. What spilled out would have been immediately dismissed as lies and hallucination were it not for the earnest, pleading stares of those reporting. Command calmed them with explanations of battle fatigue and strange gas weapon tests, and shared silent, focused stares as the cowed men were ushered out. Corporal Lawrence had little to report. Of his time in the hole, he could, or would, say little. He stated that he had slipped and fallen into what may have been some long-blocked underground pool, or perhaps a buried latrine. Of the sounds and smells reported by the private, he had nothing to say, only that he struggled a short time, then managed to get back out just as the men arrived. Truly, he seemed none the worse for wear. In fact, he seemed in better spirits than many had remembered ever seeing him, favoring the commanders with a wide, giddy smile as he was dismissed with a warning not to discuss the events. The corporal proved a changed man over the next few days. He was more talkative, but quickly had men wishing for his old, unsettling silence. He rambled about the joys of closed spaces, of creation and destruction that seemed to spring up all around him, about human pleasures missed, the dimensions and ages of which made some men threaten Corporal Lawrence with a quiet and ignoble death, which only seemed to stretch the near constant smile on his face even wider. Private Dixon, one of the corporal's bunkmates, whispered to a friend that he had woken once to find the corporal standing over him in the night, his eyes as bright and flat as silver dollars. They found the private the next day snarled in the barbed wire, his intestines spread nearly 10 feet around him in every direction. Not one man from that trench survived the Great War, although few died in battle. A wave of sickness took the trench a few days after Private Dixon's death. A strange, wasting sickness. It seemed to eat the flesh like acid, men waking to find previously healthy flesh eaten down to the bone, oozing and blackened. A surgeon was found in the latrine, beset by a living carpet of rats. They refused to quit the body even when shot, and attacked several men before the body was recovered. Relief finally came, the bulk of the men being sent to various hospitals, many wasting away before they ever reached a bed. Corporal Lawrence himself was remanded to a French mental ward, transferred after several complaints from the hospital proper where he was first sent. It seemed his behavior hinted at a growing mental imbalance. culminated with an attempted assault of a nurse, which ended with the loss of 3 fingers from her right hand and the vision in her right eye. The corporal would rant quietly to the other patients, whispers about endless halls, pursuits in the dark, flesh laid out like pages of a book. It was dismissed as so much war fatigue, even as behavior grew less violent and more unsettling. He vanished several times from the ward, only to appear several hours later as if nothing had happened. When pressed, he would begin to sing "My Bonnie Lies Over the Sea" in an endless monotone until the doctors left exasperated. Others on the ward clamored to be transferred from the whispering madman. A stale, musty foulness seemed to sit in the air where he stayed, and incidents of infection and the strange consuming sickness that had beset his home trench seemed to follow him like a cloud. Numerous attempts were made to transfer the man, only to be met with bureaucratic confusion. No records were found of the man, no entry papers, commendations, or incidents, not even a birth certificate. Through it all, he just sat for hours on end, cross-legged on his bed, occasionally humming tunelessly or rambling off the names of his wardmates between short, bubbling gurgles. Corporal Lawrence and 18 men vanished on one November night, between a 5-minute nurse rotation at 3 in the morning. The room reeked of rust, oil, mold, and sweet rot. Thick black swaths of crumbling ooze coated the beds and several of the walls, wide patches of it smearing and eating into the floor. Of the men, there was no sign at first. As they searched, one nurse shifted aside a bed, only to shriek and nearly trip across one of the sunken, reeking depressions in the floor. In a tight, perfect spiral were what appeared to be hundreds of teeth, resting neatly on the floor. After counting, they accounted for the total of all the teeth of every living soul in the ward. But one. The corporal was never found, nor were the men. The incident was swallowed by the constant barrage of horrors from the front and forgotten with ease. Stories of a cursed trench wandered across the front lines, often squelched for being bad luck. Still, they came. Stories of strange deaths, of disappearing men found days later, alive but broken and twisted beyond comprehension. Stories of a strange, dark figure stalking the bomb-ridden towns of Europe. And next is titled "When the Day Broke the Unbreakable Reptile" by TopHatBionicle. When you're assigned to SCP-682, they tell you that there are 3 laws of nature that you must believe. 1. There is no such thing as immortality. Everything will die eventually, be it from murder, accidents, or just old age. 2. Everything has a weakness. If everything can die, then anything can be made to die. Anything can be killed. 3. Under no circumstances can you believe, even for a second, even subconsciously, that SCP-682 can't be killed. Of course, those apply more to the researchers trying to terminate SCP-682, but I still believed them wholeheartedly. I wasn't here to try to terminate 682 though. I was a psychologist, sent in by the Foundation to try to study the reptile and to make a psychological profile of it. Essentially, I was trying to understand how the mind of pure destruction and hatred worked. It was part of a new initiative in the Foundation, trying to improve the containment procedures of sentient SCPs through understanding them psychologically, and maybe even find a way to make them more complacent and reduce the number of attempted breaches. Everyone said I was mad when I requested 682. Maybe I am. Maybe I wouldn't have been here if I wasn't mad, but here I was every day for a month, staring at a giant, murderous, hard-to-destroy reptile in a vat of acid. And I think it was staring back at me. I knew that 682 would never cooperate with questioning, or knowingly give me any insight into its psyche, so I resolved to sit and watch it until it started talking to me, Every day, I sat with a pen and notebook, watching the reptile. And when he had nothing better to do, he watched me back. I felt like I was Clarence Starling staring at Hannibal Lecter, except Hannibal at least talked. I knew 682 found me and all the other researchers disgusting. I knew it wanted all life on Earth dead, but I wondered if maybe, just maybe, curiosity would get the better of him. We'll never know, because one day the sun decided that it wanted all life on Earth dead too. On that day, I stood in disbelief, in a doorway just barely out of reach of the sunlight, staring out into the sun-bleached world. Heat charred the bare earth. Reds and oranges danced and pulsated where there was once greens and blues. Friends and co-workers were melting, turning the landscape into a nightmare surrealist painting. Yet, all I could stare at was 682. Flesh melted off the reptile's back almost as fast as it could regenerate it, maybe faster. It smelled like burnt, rotting flesh and hatred, and sounded like tar bubbling and boiling in the deepest pits of hell. What terrified me in that moment, more than the containment breach, more than the melted people around me, more than the hateful sun, was that no matter what adaptations it tried, the reptile was still melting. And despite myself, despite everything I'd held faith in and worked for, despite the 3 natural laws that I held higher than any regulation, rule, or religion, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that SCP-682 was dying. After several failed adaptations, 682 resorted to piling the already melted flesh on top of itself and curling up as small as possible in an effort to avoid being exposed to more light. It huddled under the mass of wiggling flesh that had melted off of its back, even as it seemed the flesh itself was trying to get away, curled up under an umbrella of its own melted back, shying away from any sunlight that threatened to touch it. 682 almost looked scared. The reptile must have noticed me staring at it, because it then did the one thing I wanted it to do for weeks. It spoke to me.
I don't want your pity, human.
It turned to look at me, ignoring the sunlight melting the tip of its snout to do so.
Aren't you happy? You finally found a way to kill me. Isn't that what every disgusting human in this wretched place wanted?
Not like this. I finally found my voice. All I wanted, all the Foundation ever wanted, was to protect humanity. Killing you at the cost of humanity itself? That's not a victory. That's the worst defeat we could have ever had. Then my anger rose, along with my voice. Aren't you happy? Almost every living thing on Earth is dying. Isn't that what you wanted? 682 may have chuckled, or maybe it was just the boiling of melted flesh, but even through all that heat, the reptile's voice sent a chill up my spine.
I know death. I revel in death. I want death for every disgusting creature that lives. But this...
682 snarled at the flesh, hissing like a snake.
This is worse than death. Worse than life. Worse than anything either of us could imagine. Even for something as revolting for you, this is not a punishment I would wish.
Is that why you're coming back inside? I don't know why I said it, or why I kept talking after I saw the anger flare up in the reptile's eyes. You hate all life. Does that include yourself? Do you think this death, or not death, is a fitting punishment for you? I knew I was signing my own death certificate. 682's hatred eclipsed its survival instinct, and it slowly got up and lumbered towards me, dragging the flesh on its back with it. In hindsight, I should have run. I should have at least closed the door. I still can't figure out why I didn't. The reptile collapsed before it got back inside, before it could even get close enough to hurt me. More and more of its body melted, and its regeneration tried desperately to keep up. I must have been hallucinating, or maybe it was just a piece of melting flesh. But I swear, I saw a tear fall from 682's eye. Does it hurt? Was all I could think to say. A stupid question, really, and one I should have never asked, but 682's answer surprised and terrified me.
Not the way you think it does. You and your termination attempts have caused me far greater pain.
The reptile shifted under the weight of its own melting flesh, turning to look me right in the eyes.
Do you want another tidbit for your database, little scientist? I'll give you one. Every one of your attempts to kill me has been excruciatingly painful, but that's nothing compared to the pain of regenerating after each one. It seems that part of my curse is to feel twice the pain when healing than what I felt from the injury.
My mind raced through every termination attempt on 682, every painful procedure, every excruciating moment the Foundation had put it through. I didn't even know a quarter of them, but I already wanted to hurl.
But this is nothing like that. The melting doesn't hurt at all, not physically, and the regeneration is little more than a tingle. No, the only pain I feel is knowing what I'm becoming, and what I have to admit to myself.
682 inched closer. I should have left. I should have closed the door. I definitely shouldn't have asked any other questions. What are you becoming? I choked out. And what do you have to admit? The reptile dragged itself to within centimeters of the door. I still couldn't look away. I still couldn't believe what I was seeing.
I have to admit that you were right. That deep down, there's no living thing I hate more than myself. That every day I wish your next attempt to kill me would succeed, and I could finally pass into eternal damnation. And that maybe melting into an undying pile of flesh is the only punishment I could truly deserve. As for what I'm becoming...
Finally, pushing up from its crouch.
That should be obvious soon enough.
Oh God. How do I even describe the sound that it made? It was like a cry of pain and a sigh of relief, a scream of hatred and a shout of pure joy, all rolled into one. 682 threw the flesh that had been shielding it off its back, stood on its hind legs, and screamed at the sun. As long as I live, I will never forget seeing 682 melt and regenerate and melt constantly as the sun beat down on it. The pile of flesh grew bigger and bigger as the reptile shed its melting skins one after another, each one wriggling and writhing as if it were alive. I think I know what hell looks like now. All I could do was stare in horror as 682 threw layer after layer of melted skin off its body. I've seen 682 survive tortures and mutilations crafted by the most sadistic minds on Earth, and yet this was more horrific than all of them combined. It was like the sun was fighting 682's regeneration to see which was faster, and 682 was helping the sun. Suddenly, I was yanked back and the door closed in front of me.
The hell are you doing? There's an XK in progress and 682 broke containment. We have orders to shelter in place so we can do fuck all about it. And you're just standing there gawking at the doorway while whatever the hell that... Hey, are you okay?
When you're assigned to 682, they tell you there are 3 laws of nature that you must believe. 1, there is no such thing as immortality. Everything will die eventually, be it from murder, accidents, or just old age. 2, everything has a weakness. If everything can die, then anything can be made to die. Anything can be killed. 3, under no circumstances can you believe, even for a second, even subconsciously, that SCP-682 cannot die. On that day, I stared blankly at the MTF. All I could say was 3 words. 3 words that, on any other day, would have been cause for the greatest celebration the Foundation had ever seen. 3 words that, on that day, of all days, were absolutely terrifying. SCP-682 is... dead. The next story is the promised discussion of the on-site nuclear warheads, titled The Nuclear Option by Captain Kirby. You are standing on top of an atomic bomb. No one at the orientation believed the director. They never do. We all just chuckled and waited for him to shoot us a playful smile, but the light laughter turned to silence, and his face never changed. You are standing on an atomic bomb, and one day, you might have to detonate it. By the end of that orientation, after hearing the emergency procedures and protocols for activating a nuclear warhead, I comprehended this fact, but I never understood it. Not as the klaxons blared and the emergency lights flooded the walls of the site in a deep red. Not as I heard the ripping of metal and screams from the floor above me. Not as I looked into the fading eyes of the director. His hand, bloodied and broken, places an envelope in mine. It's labeled authorization codes. I can feel a key inside of it. You are standing on an atomic bomb. His body falls limp. He is dead.
On-site nuclear warhead protocol. All major Foundation sites are to be outfitted with an on-site nuclear warhead. In the case of a major containment breach, where it is believed that anomalies will make mass and unrecoverable contact with the baseline human populace, this warhead is to be detonated to ensure the continued success of the Foundation's mission. Each warhead is outfitted with remote detonation capabilities, and, given the proper authorization codes, can be activated at any major Foundation site. However, due to the possibility of communicational interference that could be caused by a containment breach, all warheads may also be activated manually and on-site. If a warhead is detonated in this manner, it is assumed that the site was under a severe and otherwise irrecoverable containment breach, and thus there will be no countdown. The decision to detonate a nuclear warhead must be unanimous among the following individuals. 1. The site director, who has the requisite information regarding the site to determine the likelihood. 2. The lead on-site containment specialist, who can assess the severity of the breach in question. 3. At least 3 O5 council members.
I sprint down the stairwell, practically leaping down flights of stairs, into the breach, deeper and deeper. I overestimate my power and tumble face first into a wall, but the pain is numbing and I just kept going, deeper and deeper. The outlines of monsters play out through the windowed doors. Each floor is home to new amalgams of shadows and silhouettes that my brain was better off failing to comprehend. This is what they warned us about. This is what happens when things go bad. Finally, I hit the bottom of the stairwell. I open the envelope and unfurl a slip of paper inside. I punch the first passcode into the door. I can barely read it through the blotches of blood. The door clicks. I burst my way inside, to the only room that has been untouched by the catastrophe. It feels like a scene out of a 1980s sci-fi movie, with analog control panels and CRT monitors. The surfaces are coated in dust, and the corners are colonized by spiderwebs. I can feel my hands shaking. I take a deep breath.
Doesn't it bother you?
Doesn't what bother me?
You know, the thought that any moment you might just evaporate in a blast of fire and radiation?
Because I work here?
Well, yeah. We're standing on top of an atomic bomb.
I just don't think working here is any different from waiting tables in that respect.
Do I have to repeat the thing about the atomic bomb under the floorboards?
Jerry, ultimately, the question isn't about the distance to the bomb, right? The question is about the existential dread, the fear of being the next Chernobyl. And while that has its own sense of fear, the end result is not that different from a city on the coast becoming the next Hiroshima. The only difference is whether the blast is coming from below or above. But it's all the same. It's all the same fire. It's all the same ash. Same radiation poisoning.
And you're just okay with that?
We've been living on the other end of a gun called the nuclear bomb since the mid-1940s. Just because you finally realize that doesn't change the fact that we don't
accept that.
Then run for fucking president, Jerry. Join a disarmament movement, but you're not gonna fix the problem working for the Foundation.
The site directors and the overseers talk a big game about how difficult their job is, how hard it is to make the decisions they do. They have had to sacrifice so much to maintain normalcy, and that they can feel the weight of each and every life on their shoulders. Atlases, the lot of them. They tell us this from behind their nice fancy desk, in their office lined with mahogany bookshelves and diamond chandeliers, or from behind a screen halfway across the world, where they then lean back and feel the weight of the little number in their spreadsheet going up and down. They aren't the ones turning the key. They aren't the ones pressing the button. They aren't the ones making the decision. I feel the weight of the brass in my palm. It sapped the heat from my hand, and now feels like an extension of my fingers. I shove it inside the control panel, which blinks and whirs to life. The Foundation started putting atomic bombs in their sites ever since Oppenheimer blew one up in New Mexico, even as the Foundation expanded in the 60s and 70s, building up the massive Site 17, Site 19, Site 43, Site 120. The nuclear warhead remained a fixture of the architectural layouts. And they weren't clueless about the placement of the sites either. They were remote, so far away that only a few thousand people would even see the smoke. But that was 50 years ago, and nobody properly understood the scope of urban sprawl, the winding tendrils of suburbia that stretch across developed nations. Now, a major highway runs by Site 17. Real estate developers build up the swamps surrounding Site 23. This site is only 3 miles away from a middle school. I have just armed an atomic bomb. The small plastic cover for the final detonation button lifts. It's small, and it's red, and it's flashing. I press my thumb over the button.
Hey, do you really think you could do it?
Yeah.
How?
Oh, don't give me that look. I'm not gonna act like it's some noble decision. We have a job to do, right? We're here to protect normalcy. I'm gonna fucking do that. And besides, I know I'm a piece of shit for this, but if I'm going down there, I know I'm not coming back up. So it's not like I'm gonna have to live with that guilt.
I recently visited Hiroshima as part of a trip I took with my family to Japan. Of course, we visited the A-Bomb Museum. It was a very well-constructed museum. A lot of museums are just collections of exhibits, antiques, and plaques. Sometimes an individual exhibit will have a sense of a thorough line, but usually it doesn't feel like it's trying to tell a story. This museum, though, it told a story. It painted a very vivid picture of the devastation of the atomic bomb. It made really stunning usage of testimonials from survivors and the families of the dead, of pictures taken during and after the bombing, and a lot of other media. You first enter this long, dark passageway that has these frosted windows, but you can't see through them. They're completely opaque and shine this dull blue color which dimly lights the whole museum. Then come the paintings of the victims, each horrible in their own way. Not because of the excruciating detail, but rather the lack thereof. How red blotches depicted boils, or groups of thin red and gray lines represented how threads of torn clothes had entangled with flesh. All of this next to actual pictures of burn victims with ulcers on their tongues and charred skin across their backs. It's at this point I realized how many parents were taking their children to see the museum. So many little Japanese boys and girls looking at carnage I hadn't seen until I was at least twice their age. I guess it's never too early to be taught the horrors of war. After the paintings, we walked through a hall lined with pictures of children killed in the explosion, paired with a pair of gloves, or maybe a watch that they owned. All of these belongings donated by grieving families who left small amounts of how they learned their children had died. This led to the stories of the radiation poisoning victims, all of the families that had to watch their loved ones atrophy and decay until their body couldn't hold out any longer. That is the final stretch before we exited the main wing of the museum, but we didn't empty out into a main lobby or some sort of foyer. Instead, we turn the corner into a hallway that runs backward along the main exhibit. Finally, we can see outside through a glass wall that runs the length of the exhibit hall. There's a point where everyone stops and looks out the window for a moment, along the various peace memorials lined up along the courtyard, through a hole in a tree line, to see what looks to be the ruins of a school. Let's run some quick numbers. The on-site nuclear warhead is about 9 megatons. That means anything within 1.2 miles will be evaporated upon detonation, and then radiation will spread for about 2 miles. And on top of that, thermal radiation will burn civilians within 16.8 miles. Even for a site built in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, that is going to instantly kill 13,000 people, lowball. And then it will create burn victims and douse radiation on another 50,000 people, lowball. And then that's not even accounting for the wind taking the fallout and spreading it across the crops and fields nearby, or the number of rescue workers who might fall ill cleaning up in the aftermath. It doesn't even factor in the true aftermath.
Post-nuclear warhead detonation protocol. There are 2 scenarios that will occur when an on-site nuclear warhead is detonated. First, the detonation occurs sufficiently far away from civilians that there are minimal spectators or victims. In this case, amnestics are administered as per normal protocol, and communications are coordinated with the government of the respective nation to announce the explosion was part of a test of their nuclear warhead supply. Second, the detonation occurs within proximity of a civilian population center. In this case, the first and foremost priority is to maintain secrecy of the Foundation and the Anomalous. This means that the cause of the explosion must be levied on a highly probable target. This can be almost any nuclear superpower, such as the United States, Russia, China, etc. After a culprit has been named, Foundation personnel embedded in the involved governments are to advocate for peaceful resolutions. However, it is acknowledged that the likelihood of mutual annihilation is very high. Furthermore, in the case of more unstable governments, the resultant nuclear fallout may increase to a global scale. Should this occur, Foundation sites are to follow the proper XK end-of-the-world scenario procedures, including the arming and detonation of their respective warheads. Remember, if the light illuminates things that we must not see, then all of humanity must die in the dark. It would be a regrettable path, but we would be successful in our mission. A world of fire and brimstone is well within normalcy.
I am standing on top of a nuclear bomb. My thumb quivers. And now, finally, to lighten the mood, I present to you the Log of Anomalous Items, Volume 1. Now, it's hard for me to say who wrote this log, but it was originally created by a researcher of the name Sophia Light, and has been contributed to by many different Foundation researchers since then. I recommend you go ahead and check out the file yourself to see just how many people played a part in creating this log. The date of recovery and the location of recovery of most of these items has been redacted, so rather than include the usual redaction static sound effect, I will simply skip over that detail while going through the items. Our first item is listed as an Unbreakable lamp. Its current status is that it's kept in Dr. Wright's office. Notes: this is one of the first items categorized as anomalous and denied full SCP classification due to lack of value in further research and little need for special containment. The second item is a penny which, when flipped, will always land heads up. Its current status is that it's been shipped off to permanent storage. Notes: can't believe that none of the researchers kept this to win bets with. Our third item is a number 2 pencil, which will balance at a 32-degree angle for approximately 3 hours before ceasing anomalous behaviors. Current status: incinerated. Notes: I'm not even sure why this was an anomaly. Maybe it just had a very flat tip. Notice: destroying anomalous items without appropriate permission is a major violation of Foundation policy. See that this does not occur again. Site Director. Our next item is a painting, possibly a landscape, the records are unclear, that gave a mild case of diaphragmatic spasms or hiccups to anyone who saw it. Current status: incinerated. Notes: this would obviously be a pain to work with, but shouldn't they have at least tried to see how it worked? This one has the same note about incinerating anomalous objects and how it will not be tolerated. Our next item is written as normal garden slugs, whose trail has the exact same chemical composition and taste as commercial brand ranch dressing. They also appear to reproduce by binary fission every week. Current status: housed in a wildlife observation deck. Excess entities incinerated. This one, on the other hand, does not have the note about incinerating anomalous objects. Our next item: a small rock that emits a bright white light from an unknown source. Otherwise unremarkable. Current status: currently in possession of Dr. Light. Notes: no radiation, no life signs, nothing. If nothing else, it's a reminder of the inexplicable nature of the universe. Our next item is a 1964 Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum revolver. When any ammunition is fired from the third chamber, an unidentified male voice will shout, "Nice shot!" This one was recovered from Kansas in the United States. Its current status: in storage at Site 19's Vintage Weapons Depository. Notes: perfectly serviceable and well maintained aside from the anomaly. Accuracy or even proficiency with the firearm is not required for the anomaly to function. Voice sounds whether or not the shot is, in fact, nice. Our next item: a wire clothes hanger. Only long sleeve blue men's dress shirts with collar sizes between 38.1 centimeters and 40 centimeters can successfully be hung upon it. All other clothing articles simply drop off to the floor when the hanger is employed. Location of recovery: Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Current status: in storage. Our next item: a nuclear snow globe. When shaken, instead of falling snow, it shows a miniature scale nuclear explosion. It emits no radiation, sound, or force, and the explosion pattern changes every shake. After effects such as radioactive snow and black rain have been observed. At random intervals, the snow globe will contain a small shed, car, or truck, which will react to the explosion. Location of recovery: Sokraveno, Russia. Current status: in storage. Our next item: a squirrel which constantly moved much slower than normal, even when jumping or falling, similar to the slow motion effect seen in video footage. Current status: housed in a wildlife observation deck. Our next item: a cheap plastic ping pong ball that would change from red to green twice daily. Location of recovery: California in the United States. Current status: located under a locker in storage room 19-553B. Maintenance team required to extract object. Next, a white cowboy hat. Any person wearing is compelled to whoop and box dance uncontrollably. Unsurprisingly, the location of recovery was Texas. Its current status: contained in a standard anomalous object locker and brought out during staff birthday parties. Next, a 6-sided dice that can occasionally land on a 7. Location of recovery: a gaming society in Maryland in the United States. Current status: being used for research by Dr. McCallum. A note has been left by another researcher that reads, "Research my ass, he's just using the damn thing to cheat on his sneak attack damage." Dr. Morgan. Item description: Next is a .500 sidearm that discharges all loaded cartridges as if they were blanks. Current status is in storage. Next, a glass paperweight which constantly floats exactly 7 centimeters above any given surface. It was located in a funeral home. Its current status is shattered in bizarre a cappella accident. Dr. McCallum is currently being questioned on it. Next, a drinking glass that visually appears to be able to hold a pint of fluid, but overflows when more than 35 milliliters is poured into it. Its location of recovery was Illinois, and its current status is in storage. Next, a series of pornographic VHS tapes that, when rewound, would constantly change actors, sets, and methods of coitus. All appear to relate to actual filmed movies, though the quality is quite low. Location of recovery? Hackensack, New Jersey. Current status? A few of these are crossed off, so initially, missing, presumed lost. Then, recently recovered from the possession of a missing doctor. And now, it's in storage. Next, a 76 centimeter tall statue of a clown. In a room where it was placed, a giggling sound would be noted whenever the lights were turned off. Location of recovery? Germany. Current status: shot approximately 15 times with a 9mm sidearm by an agent. Agent was reprimanded. No anomalous properties have recorded in the remains. Next, an adult male capybara, Hydrochoreus hydrocarius, originally located several thousand miles away from the natural habitat for its species, with bright blue and green fur. It was located in Wisconsin. Current status: identified as a lost exotic pet with branded hair dye. Returned to owner and Class A amnestic administered. Recovery agent reprimanded. Item description: an HB pencil which cannot be used to write and only draws photorealistic images of Jimi Hendrix eating various foods. It was recovered in Liechtenstein. Current status: accidentally snapped during testing in 1993. Portions of the pencil did not retain the anomalous properties and were subsequently incinerated. Description: a 24,000 carat diamond cut in the size and shape of a common construction brick. Location of recovery: South Africa. Current status: in storage pending the identification of a source. Item description: a white cotton and polyester t-shirt bearing the words SCP, Secure, Contain, Protect on the front, and a crude but recognizable cartoon of SCP-173 on the back, with the caption SCP-173, Don't Blink. Aside from the security breach it represents, the item has no anomalous properties. Location of recovery: a thrift store in New York City. Its current status is in storage. Item description: a 16-month day planner from September 2009 to December 2010, manufactured by a redacted company, which will duplicate anything written across it into all other units. This only works for date and time entries that have not yet come to pass. Location of recovery: Florida. Current status: 17 units in Foundation possession. Unknown number remain in circulation. Research personnel are monitoring new entries in an effort to locate the remaining copies. And finally, an IKEA brand wall clock, which seems to disappear and reappear once every second. It was recovered from Scotland, and its current status is disappeared at 11:24 hours GMT in the 1900s. Item never materialized, presumed irretrievable. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. I hope you found the previous files to be informative and to properly, at least somewhat, prepare you for life at the Foundation. I will see you next week at 9 p.m. Atlantic on CHSR 97.9 FM in the Fredericton region, on www.chsrfm.ca online, or on your favorite podcast platform for your next lesson. And as we close, I would like to give a thanks to those in real life who contributed to the production of this episode. In particular, I would like to thank, firstly, Kevin MacLeod, who produced the music that you found in the background of this episode. You can find the background tracks that I used and more at incomtech.com, all under the Creative Commons with Attribution 4 license. Next, the previously mentioned SCP authors, whose content was provided under the Creative Commons with Attribution 3.0 license on the SCP Wiki. And finally, I would like to thank the voice actor Esme, who you heard during the recordings of the nuclear option in this episode. To hear more from them, just see the description for this episode.